Hey, this is Jess from Jess of the North, and today's video is going to be about the different types of fertilizers that I have used, am continuing to use, and the different context in which I use them, because I don't necessarily do the same thing for the same reason. I'm not necessarily intending for this to be an exhaustive list of all of the potential fertilizers that are open to you for use, and then there's one that I have not yet tried, but we'll touch on that at the end because I am intending to and I just haven't gotten to yet. So the first question that I usually ask myself is what the purpose of fertilizing is. And I mean that in the sense of, am I doing this for my houseplants? Am I doing this for the plants outside as a general purpose? Am I trying to target a specific type of plant? So asking yourself why is kind of the place to start. And then the different types of fertilizer, you want to probably start with the thing that is most accessible to you. And what I mean by that is the thing that you are most comfortable with using on a routine basis, and not that you can't change your mind about that later and change how you're doing it or what you're using, but thinking of a good place to start, particularly if you're somebody like me who loses track of time. I absolutely have a routine calendar reminder for once a month to fertilize houseplants, because otherwise I will forget, and time is fluid and suddenly it is past that time and my plants are sad. Whenever you have plants in containers, usually the potting soil has either a limited amount of feed. Oftentimes you'll see on the bag it's like 3 to 6 months of nutrition or something. And sometimes it doesn't say anything, and that means that there probably isn't any nutrition. On the plus side, for your potting mix, you likely won't have any weed problems coming up in your potted plants, which is excellent, but it does mean that your plants will be hungry if you don't provide nutrition for them. So start with the most accessible thing, and that's the thing that's going to work for you, and then remind yourself if you need it. You can over fertilize, much like you can over water. When you put too much fertilizer into your solution or on your plants, you can burn the plants. So whenever you're starting, please follow the instructions on whatever you're using. If it doesn't come with instructions, then I would do your research ahead of time, and I would err on the side of less is more. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is probably what is most familiar to most people, and that's just commercial fertilizers. This can look like a 20-20-20. It can be a 5-5-5, and those are your NPK values. And those are just the macronutrients that your plants need. It's not touching on any of the micronutrients or anything else biologically that they might need. It is just the chemical application of N, P, and K on those plants so that they can uptake those. Your commercial fertilizers are really convenient for plant nutrition because it is in a prepackaged form. You follow the instructions, you put it on at the designated interval, and it does its thing. Your plants get fed. It's great. There's different levels for specific things. You can buy them for tomatoes or petunias or cactus, or you can get specialty fertilizer for your specific plant if that's what you're interested in. I really only use just a general purpose, broad spectrum chemical fertilizer, and I use that really only on my potted plants in the house, because anything that I would use outside to aid in the microbiome of the soil is not necessarily what I want in the potted containers in the house, particularly if you're struggling with soil gnat problems. It's not great. So because I'm not trying to add to the soil health and I'm really just trying to feed those plants in the containers in the house, then I use just the general purpose 20-20-20. At this point I've got Jacks on the shelf, but it's not necessarily that I'm married to the brand. It was just a convenient use for me. The other thing that I've been putting in my potted plant fertilizing schedule is neem cake, which is a byproduct of neem oil. That's another thing that it's 1 to 2 tablespoons in my gallon of water water that I've let sit overnight to evaporate the chlorine off. And then I add the chemical fertilizer, and then I add the neem cake, and I put that into the plants. And what that does is it disrupts the soil gnat's life cycle. They don't like the neem cake. They don't like the smell. They don't like neem oil. So they fly out of that. I have yellow sticky traps in some of the potted plants in each room so that they aren't hovering around my face while I'm sitting down and trying to eat or do video or whatever else I'm trying to do. So that's commercial fertilizers in the context that I use them. I use them for potted containers, usually in the house. Anything that's outside, I have a different thing that I do. I have previously also tried making, it was a Pinterest recipe for homemade Miracle-Gro. If you didn't want to just buy Miracle-Gro, you could do this thing instead. So this is involving water, Epsom salts, baking soda, and ammonia. If you don't have those things in your house, I had everything except the ammonia, and finding that was kind of annoying. So I tried that mixture, and I wasn't impressed enough with the results to keep doing it. So I've let that one fall by the wayside because it wasn't necessarily worth it to me to mix that each time. It's much more convenient for potted plant use for me to just, if I'm going to use a commercial fertilizer, have it already pre-mixed. Another commercial item you can pick up is sort of closing a different waste stream, and that's fish emulsion. It tends to be a very low value in terms of that NPK that we talked about. So the one that I typically use is 5-5-5. It means it's really gentle, particularly if I'm starting seedlings and I'm needing to just give them a very minor amount of nutrition. And I dilute that pretty heavily, so they're getting something, but it's not at risk of burning them. The fish emulsion is smelly. It does have an odor. It's not necessarily an odor that lingers once it dries, but when you get it wet again, it's noticeable. So that's a reason that I don't really like to use that in the house if I can help it. Using it on my seedlings on the shelf in the basement hasn't really been a big deal because we are only in the basement for like specific activities or going down to get pantry items or something else. It's not an extended stay, and thus you're not in the midst of that fish smell for longer than is really necessary. The other really common thing that is suggested in the garden is Epsom salts. This is something that I have used in different ways and continue to use. I'd tried a different mixture that involved like Epsom salts and fish emulsion and like some cheap beer. That went fine, but it was, again, not necessarily what I wanted to be mixing every time I wanted to water the outside garden. So that mixture fell by the wayside, and I haven't continued that, which is fine. What I have continued is on years when I am paying attention and not over eager to put plants in the ground, I will sprinkle some Epsom salts in the soil. It helps aid germination and start healthy plants. The magnesium in particular is good for them. And I think that's like a cup to 100 square feet of your garden space. So it's not a heavy application. Again, less is more. But what I found the most effective with Epsom salts was a routine foliar spray. So what that means is in my water bucket of like whatever I'm using, whether it's a gallon or a 5-gallon pail, I dilute a few tablespoons of Epsom salts into that, and then every week or every 10 days, I'm spraying it on particularly the nightshades. So the best pepper year I had for a crop was because I was doing a foliar spray every 7 to 10 days. And those were the most lush and beautiful plants I have ever seen. It made me really happy. I sprayed the leaves in the early morning before the sun got too hot. I live in a windy region, so there wasn't really a high risk of that increased moisture causing a problem for disease in the exterior of the yard. But having it sprayed early in the day allowed the plants, with the energy of the sun as they're waking up, to move that through their system, absorb it through the leaves, and put that food to use. The next thing I've used is, and continue to use, is crushed eggshells. I've seen people bake these, run them through their food processor. You can get as detailed as you want in this experience. I hold on to my eggshells all throughout the year. I let them just dry out, either like on the counter in a container or in the garage on the shelf, whichever works. And when I have enough of them, I just crunch them up, put them in an old coffee can, and in the spring I sprinkle that on the top of the soil. I've been doing that at this property since I've started gardening, so since 2017. And every spring I add a little bit to the top. This can be used in a couple of different ways. So it does add calcium to your soil, but the time it takes for that to break down and then be accessible to your plants is gauged in months or years. When I initially read about it, it was suggested that it was going to take a couple years. Recently, I read a different article that stated it could be as soon as like 6 months. The main thing to understand is that if you are sprinkling your eggshells on the top of the soil, it's not an immediate thing that your plants can access. This is particularly important for things like tomatoes. It's often said that it's a lack of calcium in the soil that causes blossom end rot. That can be one of those things. It's also one of many potential reasons you have blossom end rot. But crushed eggshells, we're talking about fertilizer right now. Blossom end rot will be a different problem for a different day. The crushed eggshells do add the calcium to the soil. We touched on that. They are also a really good organic pest control for any soft-bodied insects, so like slugs. Anything that's going to crawl over that is obviously not going to like the sharp edges, so that's definitely a bonus. If you are mulching, you often would likely have slugs because they like to be in that moist, dark environment. I have them because I mulch. I don't have a great many of them, but I have enough that it's noticeable, or has been in the past. I don't have as much damage from slugs as I used to when I was first starting. That may have been in part because I also didn't know at that time you were supposed to prune your tomatoes, and it got to be the size of a small, like, smart car. So it was a big tomato. And I didn't prune them, so they were really moist and not a lot of airflow, and had a lot of pest problems. I've learned some things since then. So for things like the calcium that the eggshells grant to your soil, it is a lesson in long-term goals, long-term satisfaction. You can do a vinegar extraction. I believe it's something like a 1-to-1 tablespoon of eggshells to vinegar, and then you'll dilute that into water after it's reacted. So the vinegar will pull out the calcium as well as a little bit of phosphorus. You'll dilute that into the water and then apply that to your plants. So that's a faster way to extract those nutrients and put them into the soil for your plants. That's not something that I've tried. It's something that I've read about. I don't really seem to have a calcium deficiency in my soil, so I haven't been in a huge hurry to try to find a very quick solution. I'm satisfied with adding the eggshells every year, and every bed gets that treatment. And I'm not fastidious about measuring that. I'm just scattering it over the surface of the soil. It's really easy to see. This year I was excited about planting, and so I sprinkled the eggshells on top of the mulch. I'm not super worried about that because it'll work in over time, particularly as I am harvesting and checking for the mushroom spawn and planting new things and succession sowing, and it'll make contact with the soil. It'll be fine. I'll also have enough eggshells that I could probably top the beds again in the fall. So that's eggshells. The next kind of fertilizer that I've used has been, we'll call it rotted vegetation. There's more than one way to do this. Perhaps the easiest method for you as a gardener might be what's called chop and drop, and it's that you are chopping down the vegetation, usually cutting it into smaller pieces and then just dropping it right there on the soil to rot down in its own time. That's not really something that I'm super great at practicing, for one reason or another. I think it's that I just don't like the look of it. That could be. Last fall, I did try laying down expended comfrey branches, stems, I don't know, on top of my southmost bed. I didn't necessarily notice that making a huge difference. I tarped over it over the winter as well, hoping that it would solarize and break down into the soil a bit more. I will keep an eye on that bed and see if it's more of a long-term response as opposed to overwintering and getting a good result this spring. For me, what I started with for rotting vegetation was actually rotting it in water, and I'd read so much about comfrey and how it was a good minor plant. It digs down into the soil with a long taproot, kind of like a dandelion, and brings those nutrients that it harvested from deep down up into its leaves. And then when the plant's leaves die back, it falls to the earth, and then it's redistributing that nutrition into the tops of the soil. So I started with comfrey. I bought roots for that. I bought Russian comfrey because it's sterile. The more natural type of comfrey will very quickly take over, which is not necessarily bad if you have the space to let that happen. I don't, and so I didn't. So I bought Russian comfrey, and every article I found said it had a very specific smell. I don't know if I was searching wrong at the time, but I definitely couldn't find a description of what that smell is. They're right. It does have a very specific smell. It smells like somebody pooped in a bucket. The thing that I've switched to this year is shifting my understanding that the earth that I'm growing in, so earth being soil, at my specific spot has different types of weeds growing up. And most of what I have learned through gardening has been through observation. The earth left to its own devices tries to solve for its own deficiencies, which means that there is a patch of my lawn to the southwest of my greenhouse that is really prone to thistles. That probably means that I have a lot of compacted soil right there, and it's trying to solve the problem on its own. I've got other parts of the lawn that are more prone to dandelions. Those similarly have a taproot. They're full of a whole bunch of vitamins and minerals, very edible, makes excellent tea, does function as a diuretic, good to know. Before you have cups and cups of it, don't do that. And then I've got some thistles, and what I'm getting at is the earth that I'm working in is trying to solve its own problems by getting the minerals from deep into the soil and bringing them up to the top so that it can redistribute that nutrient. So instead of only putting comfrey leaves in the water, I've been adding the weeds that I'm pulling out. And this should provide a more broad spectrum nutrient profile for all of my garden. And because I have increased the amount of garden that I have to 350 square feet, I have increased the bucket. So I'm using a 35 gallon trash can. I filled it with city water, which I let evaporate off the chlorine, and then I've just been adding vegetation to it. This is really satisfying for me because it means that I'm no longer waiting for the weeds to die back so I could use it as a brown in my compost pile It means I'm not throwing them away. They're getting put to use, which I find satisfying. So I think that rotting down your vegetation is perhaps the easiest and most beneficial way to apply, and cheapest way to apply nutrients to your plants. You're using what you likely already have access to and don't need to purchase, unless you're choosing to purchase comfrey crowns, in which case, go for it. It's worth noting that because I live in a cold climate, I'm in zone 4, it can get down to -30 Fahrenheit. So prior to winter, it's important to empty those buckets, whatever you're using to rot down that vegetation, and any debris that's left, I just add to the compost pile that I put to bed for the winter as well. I rinse out the bucket and I store that until next spring. We do it over again. There is an excellent book by Nigel Palmer that talks about storing these kinds of micronutrient things for your garden in containers in your house that are a little bit more accessible. That's something that I'm just diving into. So when I opened this video, we talked about it's important for you to start with what's accessible to you. I have been gardening since 2017 and my process has changed since then. The scope of the garden I'm working has changed since then. I started with 2 raised beds, and it's important to start small because you don't know what you're doing. And a lot of what you learn is through practice and failure, and the only way you get better is by trying again. So I've worked up to this larger bucket system. I've worked up to not only using the comfrey that I purchased for this, but the other things that are available at my site, which is a principle of permaculture, making use of what you have and trying to make the most of all the things that you have in place. I did see a neat diagram that, if I can work out the best place to put it, involved a vertically mounted pipe, I would assume black to help solarize the vegetation you're going to put in it, and then they put a bucket underneath this pipe, and this diagram suggests that you put the comfrey up at the top in the pipe, shove it in there, and let it rot on its own, and it will produce a more concentrated rotted liquid from that vegetation. And because the water's not added to it, it supposedly is not smelly. As I haven't actually tried that and I've only read about it, I can't tell you. If any of you have tried it, let me know. I would be honestly curious to know if I can get rid of the poo smell. That'd be great. So, but the letting it rot down in that type of diagram would obviously take longer, which brings us back to short-term versus long-term rewards. The other thing that you can use that I have a system here for that I don't manage as closely as I should is the compost bins. I do have compost bins. My spouse was kind enough to build that for me out of cedar. It's got the 3 bins, and each year at the end of the season I fill a complete bin, and then I can't use it again until next season because it takes time to rot down, and I'm not super great about turning and watering it as much as I should, which I'm hoping to be better about this season, but so far I haven't had time, so it's on the list. If you don't have the space or the place to do your own compost pile, which is a mixture of your green materials versus your brown materials, and you let them rot together over time and break down into good nutrients for your plants, something about your plants liking rotted things. The other options available to you include purchasing compost or manure and compost bags from a box store of some kind. I've got 3 in a town close to me that have different options available. Pick your comfort zone on which of those things you would like to add to your garden beds. The other thing is that a lot of city landfills have a program where they take the yard waste from the municipality and they turn it into compost that's routinely sifted, and it's just available for pickup. The one by me is free. You just bring your own container and load up what you want. The word of caution there is that often it's from lawn clippings that have been sprayed with a broad spectrum herbicide that can take months or years to break down. So it's always worth testing that on something before you apply it to your whole garden to know if it is going to negatively impact your plants, because you don't know what was put in it, so you can't necessarily guarantee that your plants are going to thrive in that. The other option is to get compost this year and let it rest until next year, which should reduce the impact. But as I mentioned, it can take years to break down if it doesn't take months. So that's not even a guarantee. The other option is if you live in or near a farming community, farmers, you could certainly ask in the fall for manure from their animals, put it on the beds. 6 months of it breaking down over the winter should be plenty of time. The other thing is they might have a rotted manure, so it's less of a risk to you. They might have a compost system that they do and are willing to sell to you. It's worth asking. Not everyone has that accessibility. And for those that don't necessarily have a yard to do this in, another good option is worm towers, worm farming, some sort of vermicomposting. So I purchased a worm bin, and over the winter we've been adding to it. This season is when I plan to be opening that bin and checking the different levels to see how that's been working, checking on the worm population. Really about once a month or so, I've been adding a new tray full of, dirt and used kitchen scraps. I don't have the volume of worms or container size to necessarily take all of my kitchen scraps, but that's fine because I also have the compost bin outside. So the different things that are available to you offer you different, levels of fertilization, and it's up to you as the gardener to determine which of those things is most applicable to your situation. We talked about goals. My goals for my houseplants are different than my goals for my outside garden area. And what I am trying to do a lot of this season is build the soil health of my outdoor garden beds. And what that means is adding to the soil life, which means the microorganisms in the soil. There are plenty of resources available for you to check into on that. The one that I'm currently reading through is the Nigel Palmer book. So far that's been incredibly helpful. And it talks about things that I have seen public articles about with the concern of particularly the USA gut biome. In order to increase your own internal biome, you have to be considering the things you're putting into it. And gardening for me is about accessing healthy nutrients. It's also just a hobby that I enjoy. It's been incredibly rewarding to focus on this thing that's outside of oneself, to care for it and nurture it and see it give back. Seeing how what you put in February can come to bear fruit in July has helped a lot in understanding not only the importance of short-term goals. I'm going to get all my seeding done this month or next month or next week, whatever your timeline is for short-term goals. I'm going to do all that. Yay, I did it. And then in July I have tomatoes. That's a long-term response to something you did several months ago. There's a similar thing with fertilizing. So when I put rotted manure on the beds in the fall and I tarp over them so that they don't lose too much moisture over the winter with the strong winds and the cold and the dry air that hurts your face, all of that is in service to 6 to 8 months later. It's not something that's going to help now, but is absolutely something that is paying it forward. So when you are starting this, the question to ask first is why and how. And then seeing how that affects your systems, your plants, your structure of how you have your areas set up. And then you're able to tweak it and try something new. If you have tried something that I haven't listed that's worked really well, I'm really wanting to hear that. So leave that information in the comments down below. Thanks for watching.